Hello, everyone. Welcome to our joint webinar hosted by pCloudy and Testhouse. We're really thrilled to have you all with us today for an exciting session on transforming digital testing using test automation. So before we dive in, let's cover some housekeeping rules. Your lines are currently muted, but feel free to submit your questions using the chat option that you find at the bottom of your screen. We'll take up those questions at the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. And also please note that this webinar is currently being recorded, and we'll send out the link of the recording so that you can watch again or share it with your friends or colleagues later. So now let's get to know the two awesome organizations behind this webinar. So first up is pCloudy. pCloudy is a cloud-based testing platform offering 5,000 plus real devices and browser combinations for mobile and web app testing. So key features of pCloudy include continuous testing, DevOps, advanced automation, AI-based visual testing, robotic process automation, self-healing, real-time test analytics, and much more. So with integration with popular testing frameworks and tools and round-the-clock premium support, pCloudy is trusted by 300K plus registered users from small businesses to large enterprises. So next, meet Testhouse, a 23-year-old global software testing and quality engineering company based out of London, UK. With a mission to contribute to a world of high-quality software, Testhouse has helped businesses deliver exceptional user experiences through innovative quality engineering and quality assurance solutions. So they focus on enabling total quality management for technology-driven businesses. Is all about harnessing change and innovation to benefit customers. So pCloudy and Testhouse have joined forces in a strategic partnership to revolutionize digital testing and quality assurance. So this partnership combines pCloudy's advanced cloud-based testing platform with Testhouse extensive experiences in software testing and quality engineering. So together, we are better positioned to provide a seamless testing experience for businesses. A key aspect of this partnership is mutual expansion into new markets, with Testhouse strong presence in the Middle East, UK, US, and Australia, helping pCloudy solidify its global reach. So this is the beginning of an amazing partnership, and we aim to help more businesses deliver unparalleled value to their customers around the world. So now that you know a bit both about pCloudy and Testhouse, let's move on to the main event. We are honored to have George Ukkuru, Chief Solutions Officer at Testhouse, as our speaker for the day. George has more than 2 decades of quality engineering experience and has worked with numerous Fortune 500 clients in implementing agile testing practices. He's also carried more than 3 dozen maturity assessments using digitized frameworks and value stream map to define roadmaps or strategies for agile, DevOps, and cloud transformation. Some of the use cases he's implemented include automated user story reviews, self-healing automation engines, and bot-enabled data provisioning. So with his wealth of knowledge and expertise, we are very much confident that this session will not only be informative, but also really inspiring. So without any further ado, let me hand it over to the speaker for today, George Ukkuru.
Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon to all who have joined. And thank you so much for taking time in attending this webinar. So in today's webinar, we are primarily going to focus around digital testing and then look at how is that we can actually improve the efficiency of testing that we do while we are actually testing some of these apps that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So we're actually going to take a look at some of the imperatives around digital. We are actually going to take a deep dive into some of the challenges that you might be facing. We look at a 10-point digital testing checklist or a framework that will actually help you to improve your overall experience, speed, and quality of your apps. And then we'll also look at some of the innovative solutions as well as approaches around each of these items that are covered as part of the digital framework. So if you look at to start with, let's actually take a look at what is digital in the first place. So I think everyone is very used to apps. For example, you might have maybe hundreds of apps in your smartphone. And similar to that, you may be actually using a lot of websites on a day-to-day basis. So you might be actually anything that runs, any piece of software that is actually running on maybe your laptop or your desktop, or maybe an app that is running on your mobile phone or your smartphone, or it can be maybe running on a kiosk. So any of those applications that is actually delivering a kind of a service. It can be maybe media and entertainment service, or it can be maybe a service like paying tax, or maybe the app is actually helping you to purchase a product instead of a service. So any of those types of apps can be actually classified as digital. And all of these apps are actually what you call customer facing apps, or they're basically apps that are actually open for customers rather than business. We do have digital apps that are meant for B2B, but most of the apps that you see are B2C kind of apps. And on an average, if you look at your smartphone, for example, you might be using at least 8 to 9 apps per day. And on a monthly basis, you may be actually using maybe at least 20 to 30 apps on a monthly basis. But the average, one of the statistics that I read through recently was showing that on an average, a person can have at least 80 apps on their mobile phones. But if you look at 80 apps and the monthly usage, around 50 apps are not being used. So that shows that if the quality of the app is good, or if the quality of the experience that the user is actually getting is good, if the service or product delivered is good, people might use it. Otherwise, they might install it on your mobile phone and they may not actually, be using it. So if you look at all these, there are 7 factors, or there are 7 different parameters that have been put forward in this particular slide. So the first one is around adapting to change. So as I was telling, like even if you have 80 apps, only 30 of them are actually getting used. So there are a lot of factors that actually decide or make the person use some of these apps. The first one can be basically the frequency at which changes are actually getting rolled out to the app. For example, if you're able to bring in changes to your app, or if you're able to roll out new features to your customers at a much faster pace, people who really love your app, they might be interested to see new features and new capabilities getting added. And at the same time, you should also make sure that you're actually delivering a personalized experience to your customers. For example, you're actually running maybe a content management website or a news website. So it's very important for you to actually show content to your users based on his or her browsing pattern. So he or she might have used your website to actually look at specific type of content. So next time when a person is logging in, it's very important for you to actually show content that the person prefers to see. So the personalization is very important. At the same time, you should also make it very effortless. So you may have different people with different type of skills coming into your website. So they might be people who are very advanced users of a computer or a smartphone. You may actually have people who are actually having medium kind of skills. You may have very novice kind of users coming to your website. But overall, what you should be taking care is a person who's coming into your website, or a customer who's coming into your website, should be able to use the service or buy a product that you're actually offering with ease, without much of a trouble. And you should be able to complete it in a specified amount of time. So that effortless operations or effortless way of doing things is also important when it comes to digital apps. And now you might be running a business, or you might be working in an organization who actually has maybe a web front end, or you may actually have a website in which your customers can actually perform tasks, and you may also have a mobile app. But you may be actually delivering almost the same kind of capability. So you should actually be not giving a different kind of experience to users when you move from maybe a responsive website to your mobile app. A simple example is you're trying to maybe you're actually searching for a product, maybe in an e-commerce website, you're adding it to the cart, but you're not actually making a purchase there. Maybe at a later point of time, you're actually going to your native app and then making a purchase. But the experience that you get there should be ideally the same when you compare it with the native app experience versus the responsive web experience. All of these apps, I was mentioning, are B2C kind of apps in most of the cases, and it's also exposed to the internet. So there is a good chance that there might be hacking attacks or attempts that can actually happen on the website. So it's very important to actually look at protecting your app from external attacks. That includes protecting the application as well as the data that you're actually storing within your app or within your servers. Most of these apps may actually experience heavy load during during maybe few months or a few days or a few weeks in a year, or sometimes your load may be very consistent. But if you look at most of the apps, whether you're actually running a retail app, for example, an e-commerce app, if you're running maybe a shopping festival, or you're actually having a lot of offers on your website, you may actually experience a lot of load. And at the same time, it's also important to make sure that you actually have a very high availability of at least 4 nines for your website, because otherwise you're actually losing on your customers as well as on revenue. So it's very important to actually make sure that your apps are scalable, in the sense like you're able to actually serve all the users who are actually coming into your website. Your app should be built to support that. At the same time, you should also ensure that it's reliable, in the sense like you should actually be maintaining a very high availability of your application. Visibility of brand is another factor which often gets ignored, especially from the folks who are actually working on the testing side. But it's also important to ensure that when people search for a product or a service, your site comes up maybe in a Google search with a high page ranking. It's also important to maintain the same level of consistency within your app in terms of branding styles and guidelines. All of those things are very important. The quality of content that you put in your website is also very important. So what do you call, making your site visible to your customers is also one aspect that you should be actually looking at when it comes to what do you call a digital product. At the same time, none of these apps that you see, which are actually rated high maybe in terms of usage or in terms of experience, did not actually have a very high rating when it came in. So it's also important to make sure that you look at the customer feedback, or you look at how people are using your app, and then also look at areas of improving your app by using the statistics that you can actually get from production. So analyzing usage patterns as well as customer behavior is also important when it comes to digital app, because that can actually help you to get a long way. Go ahead and implement maybe a lot of new features that can actually excite your users. So these are maybe like the 7 important factors that you should actually look at when you're testing or when you're actually looking at a digital app. And all these 7 factors should be considered while you're actually what you call developing a strategy. Maybe when you're putting together a test strategy to test your digital app, all of these factors should be actually taken into consideration. But even though the expectations are high, you may actually face a lot of operational challenges or technical challenges when you're trying to test a digital app. For example, you may not have the right set of tool sets with you. You may be actually having, maybe you're actually heavily relying on manual testing because your test automation levels are low. You may not be actually using insights that you have, or you may not be actually using the data that you have generated from your testing as well as from production to generate meaningful insights. You may not have enough focus on non-functional testing because you don't have the right set of tools or people to do it. The same may apply even to security rate aspect. You may not have a dedicated security team, or maybe you don't actually have enough budgets to actually do maybe anything around application security. But you may actually face issues in production because you're not actually focusing on the non-functional testing aspects. Either your application availability might be low in production, or you may be actually facing frequent attacks, and which may actually result even in security breaches. And also, you may not be having enough coverage with respect to testing because you don't actually have a scientific way of deriving test cases, or your test coverage on the regression side is poor, which is actually resulting in poor customer experience. And then you may also not be providing enough attention to on the digital inclusiveness, which may also give maybe poor experience to some of your customers, and as well as result in maybe a reduction in your revenue. So these are some of the day-to-day challenges you might face when you're actually dealing with testing, whether it is digital or non-digital. Some of them are common, but most of these applies to the digital world. Now we'll actually take a look at how is that we can actually improve testing by actually following a 10-point digital testing framework. So we're actually going to have various parameters that we're going to look at. The first one is going to be on automation. We're actually going to look at how is that we can actually generate test cases with better coverage by using a model-based testing approach. We look at how to improve the security aspects of your application. We'll take a look at how is that you can actually do parallel distributed execution to cut down your automation cycle time. We look at approaches like shift left performance testing as well as user experience testing. That will actually help you to find defects early and then provide a better experience to your users. We'll also take a look at things like SEO and how a tester can actually contribute towards improving the search engine optimization. And then finally, we'll also take a look at how that you can actually gather feedback from production and then use it to improve the overall experience that you're delivering to your customer, or to maybe improve the efficiency of testing that you're currently performing. So we're actually going to take a deeper, a deep dive into all of these factors. So we'll start off with model-based testing approach. Model-based testing approach has been there for quite some time, but it actually makes a lot of sense to use this when you're testing a digital app. So when you're talking about digital apps, you're not actually talking about an app that is independent or that is standalone. So most of these apps, from my experience, actually has numerous interfaces. It may be connected with it may have a lot of inbound and outbound interfaces, in the sense like data might be coming into your app from satellite applications, or you may be sending data to a lot of applications. Let's take an example of an e-commerce app. An e-commerce app may be actually connected to a price management system, a promotion management system. It may be connected to maybe a sales management system or a reporting system. A lot of systems may be interconnected, or maybe like from a retail experience that I have, at least there are maybe like 24 or 30 applications to which you may actually have interface if you're dealing with either point of sale or e-commerce. And a lot of these workflows are very complex. These workflows may have complex business rules. These workflows may have various conditions. Maybe like there might be a lot of primary workflows that you may have to deal with. There might be error handling flows as well as secondary flows. And if we follow the traditional approach of writing test cases, I'm sure that you're actually going to miss out on a lot of scenarios. And the traditional way of writing test cases for testing business processes and end-to-end, flows may not actually work well, because in most of the cases, you don't actually get documented requirements. You may have to actually assume things and then write, because most of the requirements that you get or user stories that you get are focused on the application rather than the satellite applications, or rather than actually focusing around the business processes. So the best approach that you've seen working from our experience working in banking, retail, healthcare, insurance, and other domains is to actually follow a model-based approach where you actually create a flowchart or a business process diagram that will actually make you understand, or then make a tester understand on how each of these decisions are actually taken within a business process and what happens when some of these business conditions are true or false. So you may actually end up creating these business workflows, and then you may actually use this workflows as an input to generate your test cases. So the advantage that you get there is if your workflow is actually reviewed and approved by a business analyst, you are actually getting a lot of documentation. It's actually a good, content, or a good training document that you're actually getting for someone who's coming in new to your organization or to your project to understand how the business process is working and what are the rules associated with it. At the same time, you can also use these business process diagrams or workflows to actually generate test cases. There are a lot of tools like Broadcom, ARD, Test Compass, and all of these tools that actually takes workflows of the input and then generate test cases. So you can, since you're actually using a business process diagram, you're actually going to make sure that the tool is actually going to make sure that you're actually having enough coverage. You will actually have coverage across all the paths within the workflow. So you can actually ensure that there's 100% coverage. Tomorrow, there is a change in the workflow. You can actually go ahead and update your workflow and then regenerate your test cases rather than actually going and modifying each of your test cases. And it actually saves a lot of time in terms of generating test cases as well as in maintaining it. So I would say, to summarize, like, you're actually going to get a better test coverage. You're actually going to save on time in terms of test design and effort. And you're also going to make sure that you're actually going to cover all the possible scenarios that are actually part of your workflow. So the quality aspects and the effort savings are very much there when it comes to doing maybe end-to-end regression flows or end-to-end business processes using a model-based testing approach. And there are various tools, as I mentioned, like Broadcom, ARD, as well as Test Compass, that actually helps you to achieve this. Now, if you're done with your workflows, if you're actually good with your end-to-end test cases, the next thing that you need to be worried about is what are the automation approach that you should be actually following when you want to actually automate some of your digital applications. So in an organization, you may actually have maybe like one or more, or maybe like you may have maybe like 50 to 60 different applications that you want to automate. So you should be actually having a strategy at an enterprise level on the approach that you should be actually following for automation. There are maybe like you can broadly classify these approaches into 4 different categories. You can actually decide to use an approach where you actually use a programming language like Java or C# to actually write automation scripts and then execute them. Or you can actually go ahead with an approach of using scriptless tools or a codeless tool. For example, Opkey is a good example of a tool, which is basically codeless, where you don't have to write scripts to automate your test, but you can actually record and playback, or maybe use a model-based testing approach to generate your test cases. And the third approach can be your organization has already invested in RPA-based solutions, maybe a solution like UiPath, and you might be interested in actually cross-leveraging that solution to automate some of your testing. So you may actually use an RPA tool to actually automate your testing. In some cases, especially when you're dealing with industries like maybe a manufacturing industry or maybe retail in terms of maybe point of sale, you may actually have interactions with hardware. In some cases, you may actually have to go with a hybrid solution where you may basically maybe use a robotic-based solution along with a scripted or codeless framework to actually automate your testing. So you can actually use robotic arms, maybe microcontrollers to automate some of your testing. So there are 4 different approaches, and then whatever maybe your competitors following may not work for you. There are a lot of parameters that actually decides upon the right approach for an organization, and you should be actually deciding upon the approach. Or even if you have decided upon an approach, and then if it's not working for you, you should really evaluate and then see whether you've selected the right approach. So there are various, I would say, there are maybe like 5 or 6 parameters that basically maybe used to take a decision on the approach that you should be actually picking up for automation. One is definitely the budget availability. If you don't have enough budget to invest in a commercial tool, you can definitely go with an open source solution, and almost every open source solution that is out there are basically scripted based solutions. You can also look at the technologies that you want to automate. For example, what kind of application do I have, and what kind of technologies am I having? For example, like am I actually having desktop based or maybe mainframe systems in my landscape? So then you may have to pick a tool that actually supports that kind of technology. Or am I only dealing with digital apps which are basically responsive apps or native apps? So I can actually pick a tool that actually supports maybe web-based automation, API-based automation, or maybe mobile automation. Or the third parameter that's very important is how frequently am I releasing my product? So how much time will my testers get to actually automate the test? How much of time will they actually get to actually do maintenance? So is my application changing every day or every week? So there's a lot of effort that your testers also have to spend in maintaining your application. So the speed of maintenance is also something that you may need to see. Or you may also have to look out for capabilities like self-healing, which may actually help you to reduce your overall test maintenance time. The other important parameter that your factor that you may need to consider is the skill set of your employees. Do my employees or do the associates that are actually working in my organization, are they actually skilled to write Java or C# kind of programs? Or whether it will be easy for them to actually use a codeless approach or an RPA-based approach? So these are some of the factors that you may need to keep in mind when you're actually deciding upon automation. And this actually decides upon the success rate also, because if you don't select the right approach, if you're trying to follow someone else, the automation may not really work, and you may not be able to get the required results from your automation initiatives. The other point that I would like to cover is around, again, on automation is, if you're dealing with a digital kind of an app, it's also important for you to actually make sure that you're actually cutting down on the cycle time for automation. So you might have automated maybe like thousands of test cases, and you may need to execute this. If you're actually dealing with a responsive app, you may be executing this maybe on 5 different browser versions. So if you have 1,000 test cases, you're actually executing, in fact, 5,000 cycles or 5,000 test runs are being made because you're executing the same test case on 5 different devices. Or you might be dealing with a native app. You may be actually having maybe 10 different devices on which you want to execute these tests. You're ideally executing, maybe making 10,000 runs. So every test run is actually going to take time. You need to make sure that you're actually cutting down your automation cycle time also, so that you can actually provide feedback to your developers at a much faster rate. And there are various ways of doing it. Even if you're actually using, you can actually run tests on a physical infrastructure. You can actually set up maybe virtualization. You can use virtualization technology, or you can actually set up Dockers on which you can run your test. Or you can actually, have a mechanism using which you can actually depend on a cross-browser testing farm or a device testing, product like pCloudy, on which you can actually run some of your tests. You should also make sure that you actually have an engine within your framework or within your testing tool that actually supports large scale as well as parallel and distributed execution. You should be able to execute maybe like 50 or 60 tests in parallel, so that you can actually provide your results, or provide the test results to your developers in a faster pace. So it's very important to actually make sure that you actually have these capabilities, especially when you're dealing with digital apps. At the same time, you should also have a very good mechanism to report back the results. So if you're executing 10,000 runs, you should not be actually spending time in actually consolidating the results from each of your instances and then preparing a report manually. Your your testing platform or your automation platform that you're using, or the framework that you have built, should actually have a mechanism using which you can actually send across the results to your stakeholders at a much faster pace. So all of these things are very important when it comes to a digital app. So in summary here, what you should be actually looking at is like, a focus should be to actually reduce the automation cycle time. And this can be accomplished by actually either by using virtualized machines or cloud machines, or by using Docker technology, or by actually using maybe device farms that you can actually go after, like a pCloudy, where you can actually do multiple test runs parallelly, and your framework or tool should be actually supporting a parallel and distributed architecture, so that you can actually run these tests in parallel. Now, since you're actually dealing with Agile and DevOps in almost every project, it's also important to actually provide feedback to your developers in a much faster pace. So ideally, a sprint duration, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, out of which you may get maybe 1 week to actually do your test execution activities. And you cannot actually wait for the last day of your sprint to provide results back to your development team. So it's important to actually, even if you've automated your test, it's very important for you to actually integrate these tests into your DevOps pipeline. So you may actually have various stages and phases in your DevOps pipeline. Very important for you to integrate your tests into the DevOps pipeline, then run your tests on a daily basis. So almost every project now will actually have a daily build that your developers are actually creating. And it is important for you to actually use these builds and then do testing on it in an automated manner, and then provide feedback to your developers around both the functional aspect as well as the non-functional aspect. So you can actually run maybe a subset of your test every day, maybe from a regression test point, to actually make sure that the existing functionalities are not impacted. You may not get time to run your full, full regression pack on a daily build, but you can actually do it on a weekly build and then provide detailed results. But at least you should be actually trying to run your subset of your regression pack, the most critical regression test cases. If you automated your functional testing, or if you automated the testing of your features within the sprint, you should be able to execute those test cases as well as part of your DevOps build or your daily build, and then provide feedback. You can also run your maybe your security scans, like your SaaS-based scans, SCS scans, and others. We'll get into the details of those later, as well as performance tests, along with your daily builds, and then provide feedback around security as well as performance-related aspects. You may not be able to do all of these things on your own. You may have to actually closely work with your developer group. You may need to actually work with your infrastructure group to have an infrastructure where you can actually run these tests, both your functional as well as your non-functional tests. And you may also need support from your DevOps team to actually integrate your testing to the pipelines that they're creating. So teamwork is very much required. It is not an activity that the testers can accomplish themselves. You may need to closely work with the various groups, including your Scrum Master, your developers, your infrastructure person, as well as DevOps team to actually accomplish this. So, but it's very important to actually provide that feedback around application quality. And ideally, you should be able to maybe at least find it at least 80% of the issues around your product within your sprints. And maybe the remaining issues that are there in the product are basically integration issues that can be actually uncovered when you're actually dealing with, or when you're actually working in a hardening sprint or a release level sprint. But providing feedback to developers is a very important aspect that you should keep in mind. The other important aspect is around application performance. We were talking about the scalability and reliability of applications when we're actually looking at the digital testing imperatives. At the same time, it's important to actually look at the performance-related aspects right from the beginning of the project. So you should be actually working with your stakeholders to understand what your non-functional requirements are. Or if you actually have your applications in production, it's important for you to actually look at how your application is being used currently, and then determine the scenario that you should be actually targeting for your performance test. It need not be workflows alone. It can be individual features or APIs that can be actually considered for performance testing. So you definitely need to have a performance testing strategy in mind, and don't actually wait for your performance test to start. Or maybe don't look at running your performance test when you're in a hardening sprint or a release level sprint. There is a very good chance that you may need to even change your design or architecture because of slowness that you may see when you run your test maybe towards the end of your release, especially during a hardening sprint or a release level sprint. So there are a lot of things that you can actually do upfront. You can actually engage maybe someone from your performance practice or performance testing practice, or one of your residents within your agile sprint should be able to actually do at least basic level tests on your application from a performance standpoint. These tests can be related to APIs, where you may actually test the performance of APIs, or it can be related to individual features or capabilities. And these kind of tests are basically maybe like tests that you can actually run maybe on your daily build or on a weekly build. But it's very important to actually do this type of testing and then provide feedback to your development team. And then don't just restrict your testing to the server related statistics, like maybe CPU usage, memory usage on the server. In today's world, especially when you're dealing with responsive websites or mobile applications, it's important to look at the client side performance also. Let's take an example of a mobile app. If your app is very fast, is actually behaving well when you have higher higher number of users or large number of concurrent users getting into your website. But if it's draining your battery, or if it's actually eating up a lot of your mobile CPU, or if it's actually eating up a lot of your memory, people may not be ready to use your app, or your adoption levels will be very low. So it's very important to look at the client-side performance also when you're dealing with native apps as well as web apps. So if you are dealing with the web apps, you should also look at the response times that you're actually getting, how much of time is it taking to load the first content. All of those things needs to be actually thoroughly monitored, and your focus on performance should be both on the server side as well as on the client side. And it's also important to integrate these tests with your DevOps pipeline, so that you can actually pass on feedback to your developers, maybe within the sprint itself, rather than actually waiting for your release level sprint or your hardening sprint. Similar to performance, it's also important to actually look at how with that you can improve the security of your application. So it's very important to understand what kind of tests that you need to actually execute on your application. So every application may actually have different levels of security risk. So it's important to actually do a threat modeling exercise to understand the types of tests that you may need to run, as well as the extent of testing that you may need to actually put in, or extent of effort that you may need to put in for each of these types of tests that you've decided to perform. The other important aspect is on a traditional, what do you call development, or when you're actually looking at maybe 3 or 4 years back, security was actually mostly handled by an independent security group. You may actually have a shared services group that was primarily responsible for carrying out security testing of maybe websites or maybe all your apps. Or you may be actually depending on maybe an independent security service provider, testing service provider, to actually give you the results by scanning your app or your source code. But the approach, the challenge with the traditional approach is basically you have to actually wait till the end of your project to actually go through these scans. And then I've seen in many places from my personal experience that you may actually end up with maybe like hundreds of issues, maybe a few days before the release, and then you will finally miss your release deadlines because you have to actually deal with the security bugs that has been reported by a third-party vendor or by a security testing team. So now a lot of organizations have actually given up the traditional way of security testing. They've actually, they're actually implemented DevSecOps practices where you should be able to implement, or where you should be able to carry out performance testing, so security testing of apps within your sprint itself by actually taking help from both your security engineers, your developers, as well as your DevOps team. For that, you definitely need to have a mindset change rather than actually throwing away the responsibility of security to an independent partner or to your security team. Everyone in the team should now focus on looking at the security aspects of your application, maybe from the day one of your product development. And this also requires training, as well as you may need to actually put coding practices and others in place, other kind of items in place, so that your team is also educated, as well as they're also trained to actually do secure coding, which actually helps you to reduce the number of issues that you may get when you try to run a security scan. There are different types of scans that you can run. You can actually do a software composition analysis. Basically, if you're using a lot of third-party libraries, it's important for you to actually make sure that the libraries are properly licensed. There are not much of issues or security issues within the library that you're actually using within your code. Because nowadays, every developer or every product will actually have numerous calls to libraries that are actually owned by other parties or open source libraries. You may also need to make sure that you actually do a secret scanning to make sure that there are no passwords or authentication tokens that are actually there in your source code. You may also need to actually do both a static scan of your code to actually make sure that you're actually following the standards and there are no flaws in terms of the different attacks, maybe like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and all of those things. And then you may also need to spend time on DAST, dynamic testing, to actually do a penetration testing, an application level testing, to make sure that there are no flaws, and you can actually use any of the standards like OWASP to actually validate your application. So implementing DevSecOps practice is very important. You can save a lot of time on your release. You can make sure that you're actually finding out issues early, and this actually helps you to actually meet your product release timelines, and it also reduces the overall cost of quality because you're actually finding out issues at a faster pace. The other important aspect that you should focus on from a digital application standpoint, which is an area called user experience, which I think the testers have a feeling. Most of the testing organizations or testing professionals feel that user experience is not their piece of cake, and they expect someone from the UX team to actually take care of it. That's not the case. You have definitely a role to play, starting from the time when your UX researchers are actually interacting with your actual users. You can definitely get involved. You can be a part of the conversations that your UX researchers are having with users. It can be user interview, or it can be basically feedback that they're actually taking around the prototype, or it can be a feedback session that they're having after the product is built. You can be actually part of those conversations. You can get very valuable inputs. It is very important for you to know the pain points of your users, their feedback about your prototype. It's also important to understand their expectations so that you can actually incorporate all of that feedback in the scenarios, as well as in the test cases that you're actually putting in. It's also important to actually also get involved in providing feedback around prototypes. There are various prototypes that your UX research team or your UX team may be developing. It can be low fidelity prototypes, or it can be high fidelity prototypes. And you can actually maybe provide your feedback around these prototypes so that your product quality actually improves. And there are a lot of types of testing that you can also be doing along with these prototypes, like click testing, to actually make sure that where your users are actually going to click and what is the flow. Or you can be actually looking at maybe cart sorting to see how your content should be organized within your website. So all of those techniques are very important, and the contributions of testing team also should be there in terms of the early stages, in terms of collaborating with UX researchers, as well as in providing feedback around the prototypes that your UX team has actually developed. Once your application is developed, you can also look at maybe once your testing team has actually completed testing, you can also look at maybe taking feedback from your internal users, in the sense like you can actually open up the application for internal crowdsourced testing, or leverage the crowdsourced testing provider to actually get maybe a third-party opinion about how is that they're actually seeing this app, or what are the feedback, to gather feedback on from a third party who was not part of the product team. So that's also important. Very cost-effective manner. You can actually get a lot of feedback around your user experience, usability related issues, device compatibility issues. All of those feedback is something that's very valuable before you are releasing your product to your actual users. Maybe crowd testers can also give you an equal amount of, or maybe like better feedback, which can be incorporated before your final release. So accessibility is another aspect. It's very important to actually make sure that your apps are digitally, or you actually have digital inclusiveness built into your apps. If you look at the overall population, 1.3 billion folks, or maybe users might be actually having some kind of disability. So maybe like 1 out of 6 people that you deal with on a day-to-day basis are differently able. So when you're actually developing a website or an app, you should make sure that these sites are actually usable for people who are able as well as differently able. So it's important to actually do accessibility tests early in the life cycle. Again, don't leave it to the last moment. You should also have a strategy around accessibility. Your team needs to be trained around accessibility standards, and you should be actually very sure on the type of standards or compliance that you want to achieve. Are you actually targeting maybe a AA standard, a single A, or a AAA standard? You should be actually making sure what is that you want to achieve, and then start focusing around doing accessibility tests early in the life cycle. So this actually helps you to actually make your sites more inclusive. You can actually generate more revenue, or you'll be able to cater to a large, maybe more than maybe at least more than 10-15% of your users, because there are differently able people everywhere who are actually trying to use your app, and you should be making sure that you're catering to their needs as well. SEO, or brand visibility, is another area where there is not much of focus seen from the testing community. There are a lot of areas that testers can also contribute in terms of improving the brand visibility. For example, when someone is trying to search for your product or service in maybe a search engine, you should be able to, your website should be actually coming up maybe in the first page, so that you actually gather the attention and you actually take the customer to your website. Or it can be in terms of consistency in the way you're actually putting together the content in your website. So the important from a content quality standpoint, it is important for testers to review the content that are actually getting published. They should also see whether how relevant are these content. For example, you're actually putting together content, maybe in a news website. As a tester, you're also responsible to actually go and read what kind of content is coming in, and then provide feedback saying whether it was relevant or not relevant for a customer base that you're actually serving. You should also make sure that your contents are actually having enough backlinks, because backlinks helps you to improve your search rankings as well as your domain authority. And you should also make sure that you're actually serving the right set of keywords. So rather than actually just leaving all your SEO related activities to your SEO developer, testers also have an equal amount of role to play in terms of quality of content. And also look at what your competition is offering. Your competitions might be actually coming up when you're searching for the same service. Your competition website may get listed maybe before your website, or they may be actually be having a lot of keywords that they are serving, or the quality of content what they're putting in is also very different from what your site is being serving. So all of these factors are also important. You should also look at what your competition is offering, and then you can also look at providing support to your SEO teams in terms of offering support in terms of doing maybe broken link testing. So making sure that all the links that you have referred to from your website are actually active. Because again, some of your backlinks may actually go off if your supporting site is actually being taken out, or if it is actually down. So very important to do testing like broken link testing. You should also need to make sure that your speed is optimized for both web as well as for mobile. Your site should be mobile friendly. You should also look at maybe making sure that your pages are indexed and your sitemaps is actually having all the new pages that has been created. So all of those, so you can actually provide support to your SEO teams in both of validating the quality of content as well as on the technical issues. And this actually helps you to improve the overall brand visibility across the various social media platforms as well as your search engines. The last factor that I would like to cover is around now your app is you have covered maybe 9 different things. You've taken care of your app. Maybe you've taken care of the performance aspects, security aspects, and performance aspects of your app. And now your app has actually gone into production. Now it's important for you to look at what your customers are actually talking about your apps in various forums. It can be in terms of maybe like they're providing comments or feedbacks about your app, maybe in an app store or maybe in a Facebook or a Twitter. Or it can be in terms of looking at your web analytics files to actually make sure that how is that your app, how is that your customers are using your app. For example, like what kind of browsers and devices are my customers using? From what part of the world are they logging in? What kind of language are they using? What are the pages that they're actually seeing the most? So all of these parameters will actually help you to do two things. One is looking at the usage patterns of your application and looking at the usage patterns in terms of browser usage, mobile usage, page navigation, all of those things. You can actually determine the areas of your application where you need the highest amount of testing. For example, if my customers are actually using maybe iOS devices the most, 90% of the users are actually using iOS. When I'm doing testing on my app for the next time, I'll actually do more testing on iPhones and maybe tablets rather than or iPad compared with maybe an Android device, because majority of your users are actually targeting the iOS platform. Similar to this, if majority of my website users are actually using Chrome, majority of my testing should actually focus around the Chrome browser. Or it can be around screen resolution, other factors. So you can actually reduce you can actually do a proper risk-based testing by actually using the data that you actually see from these web analytics. At the same time, the customer feedback is something that you need to see in terms of, for example, customers are complaining about slowness, which actually is a good indication for you to ensure that the next release, I should be actually putting more attention towards maybe performance testing so that I improve my page performance side. Or you can collaborate with your developers to look at what the issues are, and then maybe look at putting a patch in production, which can actually help you to improve the performance and get into a positive feedback mode. So all of these inputs that you get from the production site, whether it's social media, app store, production tickets, or web analytics, all of those can be actually used in order to improve the way you actually do testing. And you should be actually refining your test strategy after every release by actually using these parameters. So that's all what I had. So now the floor is actually open for questions. I'll take a small pause and then we can get into the questions.
Here's a question for you, George. So what are some best practices for ensuring the security of digital applications during testing?
Yeah, okay, that is a very important aspect. So as you're mentioning, like most of these apps are actually B2C kind of apps and they're exposed to the internet or to the public. You should actually make sure that one is basically when you're doing testing in the first place, make sure that you're actually using proper data that is masked, or you should be actually using synthetic test data for doing your testing. You should not be using anything from production. That's very important. It's very important to do a threat modeling in terms of understanding the risk that your application is actually carrying, and then determining the type of test that you may need to do. For example, there are various types of tests that is explaining, right? For example, software composition analysis, or you may be actually having maybe like secret scanning, SAS, DAS, or IaaS kind of test. So depending on the risk that your product is carrying, you may need to actually decide upon the types of tests that you may have to do. For example, if I'm not referring to any third-party libraries, you may not have to do any kind of SCA test. Similar to that, if I'm actually dealing with an app, I can also look at maybe the OWASP 10, top 10 for mobile apps, and then determine what are the tests that I should be actually putting together when I run my security test. That is very important. The other aspect is you should be actually providing regular trainings to both your developers and testers around secure coding practices. There should be enough focus around reviewing the architecture and design documents to make sure that it complies with the security. It's not just security, you may also have to deal with standards. It can be HIPAA compliance when you're dealing with healthcare, or it can be GDPR compliance when you're dealing with data. So your team should be trained on these compliances as well as standards. And don't leave you should be actually picking up the right set of tools. If you're actually if you're working in an organization where you actually have responsive websites as well as apps, it's very important for you to actually select a tool that will actually cater to both these type of apps. So this is very important. And I think the last point that I would like to highlight is when you're actually dealing with digital apps, you have very limited time to put these apps into production. So implement DevSecOps practices. Look at running your security scans upfront within the sprint rather than actually focusing on running it towards the end. So if you follow these practices, I'm sure that you'll actually be having better compliance, and you'll actually have maybe like no or minimal kind of attacks coming into your website or app. So these are the points that you may need to keep in mind. Hope I answered that question, Zarulin.
Yes, Josh. Thanks. Here's another question for you. What are some common challenges faced while testing mobile applications, and how do you think we can overcome them?
Okay. So I think the most important aspect when it comes to mobile application is looking at device fragmentation. So you may have an app that may, or maybe if you look at maybe an app that is actually used globally, you may need to actually decide upon what are the types of the type of devices I should be actually picking up for my mobile testing. It can be based on maybe industry statistics. There are a lot of statistics that are published by providers like pCloudy. Or if your organization is already having apps that are published into App Store or iOS or Apple Store, you can actually go and find out the type of devices that your existing customers are using, and then shortlist maybe 10 or 12 different devices on which you may need to actually perform your testing. You may not be able to cover everything, but you may need to definitely do a prioritization around devices so that you're actually making sure that majority of your customers are actually served. So selecting the right set of devices is important. You can actually use industry statistics like the ones that are provided by platform providers, or you can actually use your existing apps, the data from your existing apps to actually take a decision around this. The second important aspect is to actually give equal amount of focus around non-functional testing. So typically what we have seen is basically you may have to actually do a lot of non-functional testing in terms of testing for interrupts, testing for security, testing for speed, memory leakages, and all other aspects. So it's very important to actually have standard set of test cases written for these type of tests so that you can execute it on every type of app that you're developing rather than actually writing new test cases. So, but the effort that you may need to spend on writing test cases and all of those things, I would say like 20 to 25% of your overall effort that you actually have on testing a product, a mobile product, actually goes in these types of testing, and you can at least cut down that time by half if you're actually going ahead with a reusable testing approach. The other aspect is you may need to actually find the right set of tools that needs to be actually used for automation, as well as for things like performance testing. For example, as mentioning earlier, it's important to measure the performance of your apps also. So sometimes it becomes very challenging. People do not have the know-how to actually decide upon the tools or products that you should be actually using in order to measure the performance of your mobile app from a client performance standpoint. For example, pCloudy actually has these capabilities in the device cloud. You can use a capability to find out your CPU usage, memory, as well as battery usage. But there are a lot of tools and frameworks that are actually available there. So sometimes you may actually find it challenging to do that, but it's very important to actually keep the right amount of focus around things like client-side performance. Security is also a bit of a challenge. There are not many tools that you actually see in terms of mobile security. But there are tools like MobiSF that can be definitely tried out. But you may need to have that expertise within your team to do the testing of both iOS and Android. So when it comes to iOS security, it's even more challenging than Android. So you may need to have the right set of people as well as tools identified to actually do security testing. So security testing, I think, is it's very challenging. I would say out of all these four that I explained, I think security testing is more challenging than the other challenges that I mentioned. So these are some of the common challenges that we have seen. And then maybe the last one is basically like you may have to run your test on maybe like multiple times. So a number of devices into into a number of test cases that you have will be the number of runs that you'll be performing. So you definitely need to actually go ahead with an automated approach when it comes to compatibility testing, because otherwise you may actually end up running your test cycles for days together. So it's very important to actually automate your test so that you can actually cut down on your cycle time. And then once you have automated your test, you should actually look at further optimizing it by actually running it in a parallel and distributed mode. So these are some of the common challenges, Jarolin, that I've come across from my experience.
Okay. Here's the next question for you. Is it good to use mock or dummy data for data validation?
Definitely. For example, when you're testing an app, one of the common challenges that we have seen is if you're actually trying to test maybe an e-commerce kind of an app, you may be actually pulling maybe a few products, maybe a few customer data from production. You may be anonymizing it using a masking tool, and then you may actually start testing. And you're primarily using a subset of data, which may or may not cover all your test cases. So what you've seen is like there are cases where you may not have edge scenarios covered. For example, I want to actually have maybe a product which is more than maybe like 15, maybe like $1,000 to be available as part of my testing. But when you pull data from production, somehow that you did not have a product which was actually having this kind of what you call price. So you may not be able to execute your test case because you don't have that kind of what you call product listed, or you may have to go and manually create these products to actually do your testing. So sometimes you may actually come across scenarios to actually come across scenarios or cases where you are not able to execute a set of test cases because the data that you copied from production is not there. Or you may actually have to test maybe with large volumes of data. For example, I want to test my e-commerce website maybe with 10,000 products, and you only have copied 1,000 products from production. And you're always dependent on an infrastructure team or someone from your development group to actually get you the data from production after masking. So there's a lot of dependency. So, but at the same time, if you have the capability to create data that you need for your test cases in whatever required volumes, whenever you want it, maybe it is very, very easy for you to actually what you call do testing, and also make sure that you're having enough coverage. There are a lot of tools that are available in the market which actually helps you to synthetically generate data, where you can actually look at your data model or your table schema and then generate data in the form you need. For example, from an e-commerce standpoint, you can actually create customers, you can actually create products, you can actually create orders and all of those things. Maybe hardly it will take maybe like 1 or 2 hours for you to actually create this data. So that is one. And the most important aspect is you're actually trying to use data on your own. There's no compliance issue that you'll actually come across. For example, if someone was to actually anonymize data that is copied from production, you're definitely going to have compliance issues around GDPR. So your compliance, what you call related, you can actually forget about anything around GDPR and other things if you're not depending on production data, if you're actually having the ability to actually run your test by using synthetically generated data. And it is very common nowadays, especially when organizations are moved on to agile. No one actually wants to actually depend on a third-party team or a centralized team for data, because that actually slows down your agile cycles. And the latest trend that we see is to actually have what you call capabilities within the sprint teams to actually set up data on their own and then use it whenever they need. So in that case, mocking of data or synthetically generating data to test your digital apps makes more sense.
Okay. Here's another question.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you decide which types of tests are good candidates for self-healing? And what do you think about the criteria that we should go for to make that determination?
Okay, so self-healing, from my experience, I've seen self-healing work mostly for UI-related tests, not for APIs. I've not seen a lot of tools that actually offer that capability around self-healing of API test. For example, if you're changing your input parameters or output parameters of an API call, I've not seen any tools which have the intelligence to go and update your test based on the changes to the APIs. But from the UI side, yes, there are a lot of things that I've seen working. One is basically in scenarios where your application is actually behaving slow. You can actually have some kind of healing that actually slows down your execution rates, or in some cases when your application is actually behaving faster, you can actually go ahead and what you call increase your speed of execution. So it's very important to actually look at what you call synchronization of scripts. It's also part of self-healing, because your test scripts may fail if they are not actually in sync with your application under test. So it can be other way around. Application can be too fast or too slow. These are two scenarios where you can actually apply self-healing. The third one is you're actually having some property changes. For example, you're actually having, maybe someone is actually changing the property of a label. So that can be a good case where you can actually go ahead and actually apply self-healing. So it becomes very, what you call, important for you to actually make sure that when you're running your test, maybe in a maintenance mode, you actually look at the changes that has happened to the application UI, and then you determine the type of change that you want to make. So your algorithm, your self-healing algorithm will have the capability to actually understand the change that has happened, and then it will actually go ahead and update your test script. And then you can actually save the changes if you're satisfied with the changes that has been done. So one is basically you can run your self-healing mode. You should be deciding upon this, whether you're using a platform or your own framework. You should be actually deciding on whether to run your test in self-healing mode and then pass the results, or should I be running it on a maintenance mode, making sure that changes that has been what you call made is actually good enough, and then baseline my script. So that depends on the maturity of your self-healing algorithm. If your algorithm has enough maturity, if you're very confident that it's only going to make changes that are intended to be done, then you can actually go and run your scripts in a proper test execution mode and then baseline your results. Or initially you can do a maintenance run, make sure that your script changes are actually good enough by looking at the maintenance logs and then baseline the scripts. So these are a couple of things depending on the maturity of the scripts that you are actually, maturity of self-healing algorithm, you can determine on how you should be actually applying self-healing. But it mostly applies for changes like label changes and property changes. Most of the algorithms do not have capabilities to actually go and figure out a new control that has actually come in to your what you call screen, and then write tests for it or to add that as part of your test scenario. That is not there yet. Maybe it will actually come up in the next few months. Yeah, let's go to the next question, Jarolin.
Okay, Josh. Yeah. So do you have any suggestions for tools that are used to create synthetic data creation or create mock data?
So the tools that I've used, or maybe in Testhouse, we are primarily using two different types of tools. One is basically the Broadcom TDM tool, which actually has masking as well as synthetic data generation capabilities. We're also using a tool called GenRocket, which is basically a synthetic data generation platform that allows you to create data in multiple formats. There are like maybe in general, maybe 600 different types of data, including phone numbers, social security numbers, and other aspects. And then you can actually have this data in various formats. It can be JSON format, it can be an Excel sheet, it can be maybe a delimited file, or it can maybe an SQL statement and things like that. So these are two tools that we have used and we have found this very useful. These are tools that can be actually used with minimal or little training. So, and these are mostly used by, especially tools like GenRocket are used by agile teams, and they actually do not depend on centralized teams for any kind of data testing needs.
Right. Okay, Josh. So thank you so much, Josh, for answering those questions patiently. So I think we're almost out of time for today's session. So audience, if you have any more questions, no worries, you can mail us your questions or reach out to us through our social media. So we can get those answered, questions answered through George, and we'll get back to you. Right. And thank you so much, George, for an insightful session. We really loved having you with us today. It was really nice to hear from you today. So before we say goodbye, remember that we'll send the recording of this webinar to all the attendees. So feel free to watch it again or share it with your friends and colleagues. And a big thank you from both pCloudy and Testhouse for joining us today, to all the audience. And we really hope you enjoyed it and learned something new today. So stay tuned for future events and collaborations between pCloudy and Testhouse. So we'll meet you real soon in our next event. Thank you for joining us today. See you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.